Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Andrea Jenkins Wallace, and I'm the Vice President of Artistic Affairs at Anderson Ranch. On behalf of the trustees, the National Council members, and my colleagues, I'm happy to welcome you here today. I'm also the Director of Photography, and that is a role I'm very excited about, especially today. It's incredible to be here in the presence of two photographic powerhouses, Catherine Opie and Dawoud Bey. And like all of you, I'm anticipating a really wonderful conversation. Days like this are a big part of Anderson Ranch's mission to foster transformative experiences. And it's going to happen today in this room, and it happens every day in the studios, where amazing art is being created by an amazing mix of people of all backgrounds, ages, styles, and experiences. This is a place about artists and art making, and is a place built for challenging ourselves, for learning, and for connecting in community. That is a rare and special thing, and I'm so thrilled that we have a part of this experience today. Before I introduce our fabulous conversationalists, I'll start with our title sponsors and thank you for this series. Melanie and Adam Lewis, and also offer thanks to the individual underwriters of this summer series, Sarah Arison and Tom Wilhelm, Jill and Jay Bernstein, Melissa and John Ciriali, Ron and Jeff Citrin, Ann Cook and Charlie Moss, Eleanor and Domenico Di Soleil, Sherry and Joe Felsen, Susan Gordon and Scott Francis, Anna and Matt Friedman, Jennifer and Brain Hermelin, Barbara and John Lee, Liza and John Mock, Katie and Aman Rodan, Lee and Reggie Smith, Eleanor Sussman, and Robin and Mark Tebby. We also have incredible corporate partners, Christie's Auction House, Pure Insurance, and United Airlines, and of course, Cultured Magazine. Sarah Harrelson is the founder and editor-in-chief of Cultured Magazine and was the creative advisor on this series, so thank you. The two people here today are vital voices in the American artistic conversation, both in discussions like this and with their incredible artistic output. Catherine Opie, who many of you may know personally from her long association with Anderson Ranch, is known for photography that examines the ideals and norms surrounding the culturally constructed American dream and American identity. She first gained recognition in the 90s for her series of studio portraits photographing gay, lesbian, and transgender individuals drawn from her circle of friends and artists. She has turned her lens to an assortment of communities, landscapes, and quintessential American subjects while continuing to display American subcultures through her striking formal portraits. Dawoud Bey is known for his explorations of the Black past and present, with photographs and film installations that engage oft-disappeared histories of the Black presence of America in America. He began his career as a photographer in 1975 with a series of photographs, Harlem, USA. They were exhibited to critical acclaim in his first-person exhibition at the Studio Museum in Harlem in 1979. His work has been the subject of numerous major gallery and museum exhibitions in the United States and Europe. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome these two here today, and now I'll let them speak for themselves. Thank you, Catherine Opie and Dawoud Bey.
All right. Thank you to Anderson Ranch and all the supporters. This is truly a special place. Otherwise, I wouldn't keep coming back for the last 13 years. It's Dawoud's first visit to the ranch, and he's already falling in love. So I think you might actually get him back as well at some point.
I have. This has been a wonderful few days, and this is a wonderful place, community, an institution. So I'm glad to be here. I'm glad I finally made it here.
Yeah. So this is a dream talk for me. So for probably the last decade, I've been wanting to be in conversation with Dawoud. And so this is truly going to be a conversation. We're not going to interview each other, but we're going to talk about the relationship. We have about 8 years of age. He's a little bit older than me, but we kind of came up in photography at around the same kind of time period. He started showing in 78. I went to undergrad school in 81 at SFAI. My teachers came out of the Zarkowski School. So we're going to kind of, what this conversation is going to be about is how we've moved through ideas around photography in relationship to bearing witness and what identity means within our work. And so we're going to start off with the slideshow will be going constantly. We're not going to be talking about the images in particular, but more about our practice. And what you're going to first see is street, and then we're going to go to portrait, and then we're going to go to landscape, and then we're going to go to archive. So that's what you're going to get in the next hour. And I'm going to launch the first question, which is about street photography and looking at what it was for you in Harlem in those years and bearing witness. And obviously there's a huge history from that. But just talk about kind of Zarkowski's sensibility of photography for you, and then what you began to do with it, because I think that we share that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I'm from New York, and the kind of work that I started out making has everything to do with the fact that I came into photography in New York around and with a certain group of photographers, most of whom were anywhere from 7 to 15 years older than me. I was always the youngest one in the room. But making photography for me, being in New York, I mean, there was actually a name for a kind of practice for photography in New York. It was called the New York School.
Yeah.
It was called the New York School. And so I came into that. And what the New York School was making pictures in the streets, in black and white. Color had not yet entered the conversation, with a small handheld camera. And going out into the streets, looking for that piece of narrative information that was going on in the streets within the ongoing flow of urban activity, and identifying something that you could call your own, that had meaning to you. But the larger framework came out of that tradition of small camera picture making that begins with Andre Cortez, Henry Cartier-Bresson, decisive moment, the poetic gesture, the frame, spatial geography, and all of that. But to do that in a way that had personal resonance.
Yeah.
Because the challenge with that, even working inside of a tradition, was to find your subject matter. What are you going to use?
Right.
That
What is it going to
pictures?
be for?
Yeah, what's your subject matter going to be? So it cohered for me early on in Harlem, New York. My reasons for being there were largely because of Harlem's centrality to African American socio-cultural conversation, going back as far as the Harlem Renaissance. And then more personally, my mother and father met in Harlem. So it's been
So it's personal.
It's a deeply sentimental piece of my narrative. And so when I was thinking about what my first project was going to be, when I realized that a coherent group of pictures was actually a project, not just random photographs, which is pretty much how I started out, interested in the camera, interested in photography, and then having to make some decisions about what was my subject going to be, what could I bring to this. And so Harlem became my first subject, and project in relation to those two things, and also in relation to having been to the Metropolitan Museum when I was 16 years old to see the first exhibition in a museum that I ever went to on my own. And it was the exhibition Harlem on My Mind.
Oh, okay.
So Harlem on My Mind, Harlem is a, rich piece of African American socio-cultural history, and my mom and dad meeting there and having gotten my first camera as a graduation present from my mother and father.
Yeah.
That's where I began.
Yeah, I think it's always interesting because even though photographers go and bear witness and we're talking about the world that we're experiencing and looking at and trying to frame it, I do find that so much of it comes out of personal. And so when I first was given my camera at 9 years old, I mapped all of Sandusky, Ohio, even though it was a little Kodak Instamatic, and I made my first self-portrait. And then by the time I got to SFAI in 1981, Hank Wessel was my teacher, who was directly out of the Zarkowski School, and that was what was being taught. And he made me shoot 5 rolls a day. He said, you've got to shoot 5 rolls a day to figure out if you're a good photographer or not. And so it began to, but then it was like, well, what more can I do beyond observation? Because is observational photography just the point of having a choreography of people together? Or can observational photography deal with the relationship of subject in a larger way? And so I think that it was interesting because I didn't want to be just a street photographer like Friedlander or Winogrand or Frank, that it was really important for me to use the street in relationship to a politic of identity. And so I think both of us have dealt with a politics of identity in a certain way. But also street photography had such a large voice that I think one of the things that I think is mirrored between us two is the relationship of when we put the black and white away and we're not on the street anymore and when we go into the studio. And what's the relationship of a street portrait versus a studio portrait? And how do we have to change our own language in relationship to that? And,
change or expand?
Well, I think both expansion and change. I
Yeah,
think
because I think for me, I think, well, from the outset, what I wanted to bring to this conversation was to insert the black subject into all of these ideas. Yes, it was coming out of Zarkowski School, yet it was very much related to the kinds of pictures. There was a group of New York photographers, Winogrand and Friedlander, who gathered on the 4 corners of 57th Street and 5th Avenue.
Right.
And like, we all knew this. Like we knew the kinds of pictures that were being made, the kind of pictures in retrospect that were making the history that we were stepping into. But for me, the thing that I wanted to bring to it was the thing that I knew best, and that was the lives of African Americans, since that's who I am, since that's who my family is. So I guess for me, from the outset, it was always 2 projects. It was a social project, and it was an aesthetic project. Because the quality of the object, the photographic object, always mattered to me as much as what it was you wanted to talk about.
well, you didn't want to make snapshot portraits.
No.
You weren't
I wanted
interested in a
to-
lens like Nan Golden or other people of our
No.
period of time. You
No.
were
I
interested.
wanted to emulate the rigor and the refined formal quality of Roy D. Carrara's photographs. Roy D. Carrara was the first photographer to really exert an influence on me, where the photographs were an extension of the lives of the largely African-American individuals that he was photographing. But he was also developing a visual photographic and material language.
Well, the metaphoric relationship of blackness in the images are everything. And that was like so important to how we began to discuss that as well, because he was able to change the language with his lens. And so, you know, I'm always asked in a certain way, like, do you think that you changed things because of the pictures that you've made? Do you think that you've changed the representation of the queer community? You know, and it's so hard because when you're making the images, you're not necessarily thinking of what they will be in history later, because you're so within the body of work. So,
but you are, for me anyway, I don't know how it's been with you, but because I was surrounded by that history and knowing DeCarava and knowing other photographers of an older generation, I was conscious of the history, and I wanted to contribute something to the history. Of course, you can't know what that's going to be, but you do have to have a sense that the work is going to live beyond this moment, and hopefully it will have some resonance as time goes on. And your question about moving from street photography to a different kind of photography, because for me, street photography, the conversation within the photography community began to change, and this question of the ethics of street photography began to emerge, and I couldn't ignore that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting. Yeah, exactly. When P.L. DeCourcia's, heads when he made that body of work in relationship to then, it's an interesting question, and it's something that both of us as longtime educators as well had to grapple with in the classroom in relationship to student work that's coming in, is like, what are the ethics behind the relationship of representing people that we don't know?
And that, for me, is what led to the end of my making photographs of people without their consent in Harlem and in the streets of New York, and deciding to make that a more directly consensual and participatory act. It was that conversation, literally. And it was seeing one photographer in particular, who I know you know, but whose name I won't mention. But if I describe his work and methodology, he uses a Leica camera, short photo, a very wide angle lens, a flash, and he gets very close to people and makes photographs of them and then steps away. And I happened to see him photographing one day in the village.
Did you turn the corner?
And then I saw him. I said, oh, this is that guy. This is him. And then there was an older couple coming. He stood up against the wall, and then when they got close enough to him, he stepped out, put the camera. He was closer to them than I am to you now.
No, it's hunting.
And the look on their face, they looked like they had been mugged.
Yeah, no, that was
And by degrees, it was very far from the kind of work that I was making, but it still dealt with this, a subject who participated unwittingly or unwillingly. And it was an extreme example that made me question this whole notion of making photographs of people without their consent or participation. And out of that, I decided to continue working in the streets, using the streets more as a studio. And I went out and got a used 4x5 camera, learned how to use it, which required putting it on a tripod. So it was no longer spontaneous, it was consensual. And that was in response to that conversation about the evolving sense of the ethics of photography. But I still, within this idea of making portraits, formal portraits in the informal environment of the streets,
So
I still wanted to make those photographs about black people. So I'm always thinking about ideas about photography, conceptually, process, but I work out those ideas with the subjects that I work with to make sure that they stay present in the conversation and ultimately in the photographs as they go out into the world.
Yeah, I think when I went into the studio and off the street, the first body of work in studio was being and having of my friends with fake mustaches. And I know that I wanted to frame it really differently. And I didn't want to end up making photographs of my friends in their bedrooms or in things that we're used to, because I didn't want to have a documentary voice within the work, even though I call myself a documentary photographer. But what is it to also change the voice of things within a body of work? So I decided to reach into old master paintings and Holbein, and thinking about the relationship. If I can make my friends look like the royal family, so to speak, of the images that are held in these national portrait galleries, then I'm onto something. If I can stop a person and have humanity be thought of versus, just like there's a dyke couple in their bedroom, then that was a position that I felt I could do within the studio, and that I couldn't do it out in the world, that I had to have their bodies be the site of architecture of identity, so to speak. But it was that decision to kind of muck up my sense of documentary photography and try to redefine my own position within it after being trained by really intense documentary photographers.
I don't know, but these pictures that happen to be on the screen right now are the first photographs that I made in the studio. And very much like what you described, these are friends of mine who I invited to come to the studio and sit for these formal portraits. The construction of them has everything to do with Rembrandt.
Yeah.
I fell in love with Rembrandt's paintings when I was in the sixth
So
grade.
Rembrandt was your guy and Holbein was mine.
Rembrandt. This
Not
is
too bad.
Rembrandt. That singular light source, the brown space of the background, the heightened sense of the individual. And I must have gone to a good public school, because in the sixth grade, I had to write a report about Rembrandt.
That's good.
Yeah, and I fell in love with his work, and as a photographer, was never able to use that until I decided I had spent enough time in the street making photographs with the small camera in the street, the big camera in the street. I wanted to see how the photographs would function without the social reference of the environment, in which a person in a particular environment is read a certain way, rightly or wrongly. If I do a portrait of you here, doesn't mean you live here, but this environment is going to become some part of the reading of that photograph. So I wanted to take that piece of sociology out and focus my attention resolutely on the person and see if I could make a kind of heightened representation of the individual. Beginning with my immediate community, and then for a long time I did projects with the 20 by 24 camera, working with young people. I took that camera, did it in London in the National Portrait Gallery with a group of high school students there, making young people, as opposed to black people, the central subject of my work, because I think young people have been essentialized within the social culture in a very real way too. So I wanted to bring young people into the shape of my evolving ideas about the portrait and have the narrative center on them, even as I began to make different kinds of pictures. That was the first time I started working in color.
Yeah.
Also.
Well, the 2024 is when you reach to the, because I've used the 2024 Polaroid camera as well, and it's really a beautiful beast of a machine to use. And you know, it was so sad when Polaroid went down as a company. It was really, as you watch the field change and the materiality change in photography, we've had to both switch up things materially. But one of the things that I'm so impressed with where you decided to not be Rembrandt is in relationship to the 20 by 24s when you break the edge. When all of a sudden another hand shows up in the next picture. The idea of diptych and multiples in relationship to not being an essential idea of portraiture. Because one of the things I've always thought about your portraits, and it was a question in my mind, but I'm gonna riff a little bit, is I'm often asked, what is a portrait for you? And I said, a portrait for me is a shared moment. I don't ever think that it's about the essential kind of being, that it is about these shared moments that we have. And I felt like breaking the frame for you was this other kind of conceptual voice of also not being an essentialist within an idea of portraiture. Yeah. Did I have that read right?
Well, it came the
I don't know.
yeah, the multiple image Polaroids came out of a lot of different points of reference. Some of them obvious, some of them not. Primarily the idea of making a single object out of multiple objects. You guys know the work of the painter Sean Scully? Mm-hmm. I love Sean Scully's work. I had also gone to see Jennifer Bartlett's plates, those gridded enameled plates. It was one piece made up, and then there was the little rowboat, you know. But it was the idea that one could make a singular object out of multiple images or objects. That's one thing. The other piece of it had to do with the question of monumentality around these young people that I was photographing, wanting to give them a monumentalized presence in the space of the museums and galleries where this work would be seen. The other was just pushing that large 265-pound camera to do things that it didn't seem quite meant to do.
Yeah, the depth of field is so shallow.
Yeah, and I was very close. And of course, as you get closer, there's a heightened quality of material description, but there's also diminishing of the rest of the figure. And in order to put the rest of the figure in it, the piece, you then have to make these multiple, you know. And it was also trying to break free of the notion of photography as a singular moment.
Yeah.
You know, photography can be multiple moments, and multiple things can be revealed within those moments that then begin to cohere as a single object. So there were just a lot of influences going on in that work. I have large Polaroids in which pieces of the anatomy, how do you move the anatomy from one frame to the next in a continuous kind of way? This idea of the fluidity of line. I love Bryce Martin's work for that reason. I love that work, this fluidity of line, you know. So I'm thinking all kinds of things when I was making that work, and bringing all those ideas to bear on these young people, that I can work out these ideas about line, time, heightened, you know, materiality, and all of that comes to center on these young people who are a part of my process. I'm sharing my process with them as I'm making the work, and then giving them a public representation in the space of the museum did the work. So I would say there were about 10 different things going on there. You know, everything that I was interested in as far as art and visual culture are the ideas that I bring into the studio. But I always want to keep it very socially rooted. It's not a formal exercise. It's about this subject. It's about this subject and giving them a central, prominent space in the larger social conversation.
Yeah.
And then the way I do it, now we start going on an interesting ride, starting with the singular one. The diptych of Lorna was the first time that I started thinking about time and movement, moving away from the singular image. So I did a series of diptychs.
Yeah, the diptychs. Yeah.
Yeah, there was a series of diptychs. Starting with Lorna, I did one with Rob Storer. Different psychological representations within the single piece. One directly engaging with the camera, and the other more inwardly
Internal.
direct. Yeah,
Yeah,
more
no, that was the
internal.
interesting thing in dialogue was that, I mean, I think I try to do it in a single portrait a little bit more, but I do like the idea of an external and an internal space of what portraiture does. Like, I think that I don't think that representation is so tricky, but if you get this moment where you have a person almost be internal versus external of what happens within portraiture, it changes the way that also you get to look at a person. Because when a portrait is facing you and you're being stared at, you feel implicated often. But if you slightly turn ahead and you have them looking off where the gaze changes, all of a sudden you're allowed to look as a viewer. So it's also like, what is the relationship between the viewer and the subject in a certain way of drawing you in to allow you to have different levels of emotion within how the portraits begin to perform as a body of work, I think is really important. But your diptychs did this thing. I remember when I first saw them, I was like, oh, fuck you, Dawoud, that's good. That's fucking real good shit right there.
Yeah, and those diptychs were about visualizing that idea.
Yeah,
You
that's
know,
what I thought.
being
Yeah.
engaged in the world and then disappearing from the world and being more inwardly directed and representing those two states of being within the diptychs. You know, because, you know, interesting thing about the portrait, and I always say this to students and when I talk about the portrait, basically when you're making portraits as a photograph, there's only two places the subject can look, at the camera or away from the camera.
Yeah.
You know?
And don't cut off the hands.
And when they look away from the camera, when they're not engaging with the camera or me or the viewer, how do you credibly represent that kind of turn inwardly? But basically, in making portraits, that's it. There's only two things they can do. They can look at the camera or not. It seems like a very narrow space to work with. But then that's the challenge of the work, to take these seemingly narrow spaces and open them up.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's what the work evolves as you're making it, because the other piece of working with the Polaroids is that as you're pinning them up, looking at them, you're looking at them together. And the conventional way of working is that you're looking at them in order to choose which one best exemplifies the situation. And that way of thinking stopped making sense when I saw them together. And I decided I should show these together. They're two different forms of representation of the same subject, but they open up a whole conversation about public facing and more inwardly. So, yeah.
Well, I think
There were a lot of ideas at play in that work.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think that in some ways, you know, both of us really got recognition in the art world through portraiture, but you and I also as photographers have never relied on a singular identity within subject.
No.
We have always moved through where many of our contemporaries in our lives kind of make, a picture over and over and over again, because that's the picture that they keep needing to see. And I've never really been satisfied with making the same picture over and over again. I think I have a portrait style. I think I can only make portraits one way, and that's okay for me because I've made a lot of them and I really enjoy how I see portraiture. But I want to talk a little bit about that kind of breadth of representation from landscape to street. And I think it would be great to move into both of our love of what landscape holds. And we're in a beautiful landscape up here, and many of you come to this landscape for the pause, for the meditation, for other things that we think about what landscape holds. But also landscape holds powerful moments of representation and what that does. And I think that I would just want us to reflect a little bit about that shift from the studio, shift from the street to the landscape, and what the landscape holds for each of us. So,
yeah, it's interesting because I think for a long time I looked at the idea of the landscape in a very genre sense. And
when you say genre, speak about genre for me. Which genre? Photographic genre or painting genre?
Well, when I say genre, landscape photography in this country, anyway, begins with the 19th century landscape photograph.
Right. So you're just talking Carlton,
and a
Watkins.
lot of landscape work, yeah, it extends. It extends largely from that work. So that's a particular genre and way of engaging with the landscape. I knew that history, but when I was making portraits, never saw myself as an active participant in that particular conversation. The last portrait-based work that I made, the Birmingham project, was the first time that I began to shape the portraits, not around the individual, but around the idea of the individual as the embodiment of a specific history. September 15th, 1963, and the dynamiting of the 16th Street Baptist Church. That shift to a deep interest in history began for me the idea that history is always present, and trying to think about how to make work that existed in the liminal space of history and the present at the same time.
But in that, do you think that is one of the relationships to history is also making history? Yeah. Because I think at a certain point after you become an exhibiting artist, you realize also the responsibility of what it is to carry forth these conversations. And I think in some ways before I was an exhibiting artist and I was just making my work, I was just making my work, but then there was a new responsibility for me as an artist, I felt, upon exhibiting in terms of really tracking the voices and really tracking different ideas, because you're also in the process of making history to a certain extent.
Yeah, I think that's always been present for me with, even with my first project, Harlem, USA, because in a way, that project, because it was provoked by the Harlem on My Mind project, and I definitely thought about it as being in conversation with that particular exhibition, which even as it provoked my interest in visualizing the community, was full of all kinds of problematics. And the progression of my work actually has been about working out some of those problematics of the public display of one's image from inside or outside of a culture. But Birmingham got me thinking about history. And even as I was making that work, I was driving around Birmingham making a lot of photographs of the place. But at that time, I called them my reference pictures.
Uh-huh.
They were reference pictures made to help ground me in the experience of place. But even though they were made with a small digital camera, it's hard for me to make a throwaway, casual kind of observation. So they were very intentionally made, but I saw them as being reference pictures. When I completed the Birmingham portraits, I had an idea that I should come back and expand that. I need to look at this place a little bit more deeply, because it was clear that the place itself held history.
Right.
In the South, you can smell the history in the air. History hangs so heavily in the South, you feel like you can reach out and touch it, you know? And so that began my interest in wanting to examine more deeply place, but not through the human subject. I didn't get to go back to Birmingham and do it, but I ended up starting that work in Cleveland, Ohio.
Yeah.
With the Underground Railroad.
You know, I grew up in
project.
Sandusky, Ohio.
I know. We talked about that.
Yeah.
You had suggested I
Because
might
all
want-
the old houses had all the hiding areas because it went over to Canada.
I remember
in terms
talking
of,
to you about that.
And it was really profound when I was a kid to go to these older houses and understand the relationship to slavery, because during, you know, I was born in 1961, and how was I taught about slavery in a white family from the Midwest? Was basically Roots, right? Roots came on TV, and all of a sudden we're all sitting in the living room talking about slavery for the first time in a way that wasn't talked about in school. And now it's being erased again in America. And it's like all being erased again. And you know, that I think is partly why we are photographers, both of us, is because of erasure to a certain extent. You can't erase a history in relationship to an archive of image making. You know, that's why I wanted to be a social documentary photographer, was because of Lewis Hine photographs of child laborers, that he was actually able to change the laws in this country. And so at 9 years old, I asked for a camera because I wanted to be a social documentary photographer. And I actually ended up doing it, which is super weird. My dad was super surprised. But those landscapes are so important. And I'm wondering, you know, because I think of landscape in all these different complicated ways. I think of landscape as portraiture. I think of landscape as markers of identity. I think of a landscape as a poke at Nat Geo photographers. Like, I think about landscape in all these like really complicated ways of what place holds. But when you started that body of work, what did you discover? What did the land tell you? Because the land speaks to us.
Yeah, it was a very different way of seeing, thinking, and working. That particular project, Night Coming Tenderly Black, trying to think about how to make work that didn't document the path of the Underground Railroad in a literal sense, but to figure out how to make work that inhabited that experience, as if the camera itself was a surrogate for the enslaved black body moving through that space towards freedom on the other side of Lake Erie in Canada. And what really helped me to frame and shape that work conceptually was two things. Roy DeCarava's photographs.
Yeah, I knew that you were having a conversation with blackness.
The
with
idea
that.
of blackness as narrative,
Yeah.
material, and subject. And that coupled with Langston Hughes' poem,
Right.
Dream Variations, and the last stanza of that poem, night coming tenderly, black like me. Whoa, now I got something to work with. You know, this tender blackness, not only has it been revealed and called out in Langston Hughes' poem, but also visualized in Roy D. Kawava's photographs. So I decided to use those two things as a way of conceptually shaping how I was going to deal with visualizing, making visual the movement through the northeastern Ohio landscape and ending at Lake Erie. And because the experience itself was carried out largely under cover of darkness, I wanted the photograph to embody that. I always remind people that they weren't made under cover of darkness because it's hard to get the rich material quality that those photographs have if you go out and expose film at nighttime. Because I'm still an analog photographer working with film. And so they were made to suggest the vantage point of a black body in that space.
Okay.
You know, positionality. What might that have looked like and felt
So
like?
a tree in the center, is a tree, or does it become a body?
Sometimes, or if I was photographing, like I did a lot of research and I knew where some of the actual underground railroad stations, as they call them, the safe houses, where fugitive enslaved African Americans took temporary refuge. So if I was going to photograph that house, I wouldn't stand in front of it and photograph it. I would stand slightly behind a bush, you know, like where would that body have been in relation to that place? And then they were all printed darkly to suggest the quality of nighttime or dawn, or the time when those fugitive black bodies would have been moving
through that space, yeah.
Yeah. So
yeah.
it was a very complicated project because it was the first project that I did that didn't depend on the human figure. But I often tell people that that human figure is there in those pictures. It's just moved from here to back here,
right,
behind the camera. Mm-hmm. You know, because that's what informed the vantage point, is that human, you know, that imagined human figure. So the figure is there, and it's all of the landscape work that I've done since then has always been from a human kind of vantage point, and being mindful of the fact that the landscape, the land, does hold, you know, memory.
It holds memory.
It holds memory, and I deeply believe that. Some people have, you know, there are those who don't believe that, but, you know, there was something that I read in a book by Pete Hamill. Pete Hamill was a New York reporter. Pete Hamill and Jimmy Breslin were like the two working class newspaper reporters, and Pete Hamill was the poet, and then Breslin, you know, was the duke it out, you know, every man. And Hamill wrote a book. He wrote a book based on retracing the path from Brooklyn to downtown New York that he used to walk as a child, retracing the path of where he grew up. And he summed that experience up in a way that was really meaningful to me. He said that the true meaning of any place lies in what it was and what it is. And those two things kind of coexist. So any place, like this place used to be something else.
Well, I
don't know what used to be here, but if I knew, that would inform my sense of being here, because it was that place and now it's this place, and that's what it means to be here.
Yeah. I did a whole body of work in Sandusky, Ohio. I went back because I left it when I was 13. And I did a special book of it. And one of the things that, you know, is always talked about is that, you know, is like, well, you're from nowhere, or where, you know, or this idea that every place doesn't have its own special identity. So you know, I called it, you know, just like you know, I am somewhere. And because this idea of not having place, or the notion of place, has always been really sticky. But we've got about 10 minutes left, I think, and then we're going to open to Q&A. And I think we should talk about what you're thinking about these days and what I'm thinking about, because we're both playing in the archive.
Yeah, we're still in the game.
We're staying in the game. We're still making work all the time.
Yeah.
I got to see your show at SF MoMA. I did a special drive up to see it because I don't want to miss it. And we're both doing large survey museum shows. And I have 3 coming up next year that are all different. One at the National Portrait Gallery in London that'll open in March of 2026. And then I can't say this name of this museum very well, so forgive me for anybody who's German and actually knows how to say it. But it's where Documenta's place, the Friedekadium in Kassel. I'm doing a whole body of work about the idea of nature as the pause in a troubled world within our politic. And then I have another show of what I'm here on the ranch working for in Norway at the new Pomo Museum in Trondheim that'll open in June of next year. And it's interesting being all of a sudden an artist that has to go into your archive. And I did it for the first time last year with a show in 2024 at Regan Projects called Harmony is Fraught, where I decided to really talk about my length of time in LA. And I think the archive is such an interesting place to go into, because now being 64, like I'm like, oh, I have all this work that I've made, and I have to actually think about what I've made versus what I'm making. And so I don't know, I think it's really interesting because I'm trying to figure out if my archive is informing the work I'm making now, or if my archive is just this place of information for me to like really think about in these different ways, that is more about a certain sense of an older history versus what it is to be making to create current histories. And I find those voices very competing at times.
I suspect that the archive informs the work that we do. It's the, you know, the accumulation of pieces of ourselves. I had the most jolting, unnerving experience when I did my Seeing Deeply book, a 40-year dive into my work. I almost didn't want to do it, but it was such a rare opportunity. And there were things that I found. Now, the further back it went, because the more recent work, of course, I have image files. I mean, I've shown it, it's been written about. But then the further back I went to work that even now has been largely unseen.
Yeah.
And then I even went into my mother's box of stuff.
You didn't open up your mother's box.
I opened up my mother's box.
That's big, man, that's big.
And I found something that completely shook me up. Because when people ask me, when did you start making photographs? I have a whole story that I tell about my godmother giving me a camera, you know, that I inherited from my godmother. Didn't know what to do with it. Went to see Harlem on my mind. I got a sense of purpose, and a few years later that led to Harlem. This completely upset all of that, because my mother, well, mothers keep everything. What can I tell you? They keep everything. And what I found in my mother's box were photographs that I made in the 6th grade, which means I was 11 years old maybe, that I had forgotten that I made. They were black and white portraits of my friends on the schoolyard.
Oh, yeah.
Tyrone, stand here. Jimmy, why don't you stand here? And I have my little Instamatic camera.
I know. I still make the same picture.
And I know I made them because I still recognize those classmates. But I had forgotten that obviously crucial piece of my own narrative. So I was walking around for about 2 days after that with my head kind of spinning, like I had discovered this hugely important piece of myself from which a direct line could be drawn from that to this. And increasingly, I mean, I did one survey show within the last 3 or 4 years. I've done 2 survey shows. My own individual survey show that goes back, and now some of that work is being made public, and I'm seeing it on the wall for the first time. And then I did the conversation survey show with Carrie Mae Weems, in which we both went back.
You both went back, yeah.
We both went back and looked at our ideas in relation to the first pictures that we made and where we are now, which is clearly very different, but I think always in some ways related. So I think the archive, even though the pictures may look different, even if you're not doing those kind of pictures, you're not doing them because you already did them, and you're looking for another way into the conversation. So I think the archive is a really interesting re-engagement with oneself.
Yeah.
And the older you get, it's a longer look back.
It's excellent. Well, you know what? We should open this up to questions, but thank you for fulfilling a dream of mine of being in conversation with you.
Thank you. Thank you.
If you have a question, we have 2 mics, and if you put your hand up, we'll bring you a mic.
Okay, for those in the audience who have questions, I'm just going to alert you to the fact, in case you don't know, I'm wearing hearing aids. I probably won't hear your question. Kathy will
repeat it.
She'll let me know what the question was. Which also suggests, don't make your question too long.
Kathy, I have a question, and I'm thinking about your work as, photographing queerness, identity, community, and one of the slides is your show from Sao Paulo.
Oh yeah, which I got to do.
Your work was put aside, next to master paintings. So I'm wondering if you could talk about how that sort of amplified or complicated the narrative of your own work.
I cried. It was the first time I ever cried at one of my shows. I didn't know that I would be worthy as an artist to be able to hang with paintings that I loved so much. And the really amazing director at the Sao Paulo Museum, MASPI, is Adriano, who did also Venice Biennale. And they had a queer theme for a year. And so they came to the studio and they look, we want to do this show in a year. It would open in July. We want to bring all the Lina Bobardi plinths, these glass plinths that were about visibility, because Lina Bobardi, the architect of the museum, was an amazing socialist. And so we worked in the studio with their permanent collection that always hang on the plinths. And it was the first time a contemporary artist was ever invited to hang with the collection on the plinths in relationship to this queer theme, and really talking about identity and the complication of identity from that perspective. And so these glass plinths are about transparency and visibility. And I was able to create these layers of this body of work that hung at MASPI last summer. And it was truly one of those unique moments in which that I've always been having this conversation with that history of painting, but to actually see the work To see a Holbein next to J.D. Sampson was just like, are you kidding me? You know, so it was a true honor. And I'm just so happy that my images felt worthy enough for them to actually hang with these pieces that, you know, the history of art, my dad started dragging me around to museums really early on. And we owned a craft company in Ohio called Opie Craft. Any of you were hobbyists, you probably bought our products. They were basswood boxes and plaques. And so art was always centered in my life. My aunt and uncle were artists. And so being dragged to the Cleveland and Toledo Museum, which held great collections from a very young age, formed my identity in the way that I thought about work. But I'm not a painter. But often people say, hey, I own one of your paintings, and I always have to remind them they're a photograph.
Hi, thanks. Could both of you comment about how you feel in regards to your images being used for AI image models?
Oh, are they? That's my comment, is I don't follow the AI stuff. The question is how do we both feel about our images being used for AI models?
Maybe they have been. I mean, well, I guess the answer is that I don't know that it's possible to participate in online culture if one's work is online without the work being, without any say-so on our part, appropriated for use by AI. So I can't say that I've seen it. I'm certainly aware that there's a likelihood that it has been used. I'm an inveterate poster on social media. I tend to not do a lot of posting of my own images and work on social media, but all of the publishers and institutions that I've worked with, they do. So it's an inescapable fact.
Okay, and I do have a story around this.
But can I just, because my question wasn't exactly clear, I think.
Oh, okay.
And
Because
that
I do have a
is,
story around AI
since
too.
you've both been greatly affected by artists, whether they're painters or photographers of the past, and that has informed your work, right? I'm really asking, because that technology is undeniable, and other artists always find tools to express themselves. So my question is really, because the purpose of what I've heard today in regards to your art in expressing identity, humanity, how do you feel about other artists using it in ways to
It's
share?
a tool. Just like cameras change, it's a tool. I think it's going to be an interesting tool in terms of what it means as far as literally being able to have a human response to the world that we live in versus an algorithm response. And I think those are things that we really need to think about. And my story was I actually had ChatGPT try to make a portrait of mine. So through prompts. I'm like, can you make a Catherine Opie portrait? And then they did a really ridiculous job of it. I said, yeah, this is over the top, like Catherine Opie, da 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 da. And they're like, oh, let me try again. You know, and so I actually went through the prompts in ChatGPT one day just to see if they could actually make a portrait of mine. And you know, they couldn't. And that's okay, you can get it stylistically. You see photographers all the time trying to make stylized portraits that look like mine, but there's something not right about it because they're not my portraits. And so I think in the end, what's really important for us to remember is the individual relationship of how we think as human beings is completely important to how we have constructed history as a species. And that can't be replaced by AI, but what is it as a tool that will continue to inform these different aspects is really interesting to me. But I don't like how it's being used in the world of meanness. The world is far too mean right now. And it's really upsetting how you know, if our president of the country can make an AI video of Obama in a jumpsuit, you know, getting put in prison and being shoved onto his knees and shit like that, I'm sorry, but I'm not interested in an AI world like that. That's not a world that I want to participate in.
No, I agree. You know, unfortunately, the uses of AI that were the unsettling uses of AI that we're currently seeing are more pervasive than what we might be seeing in terms of how AI can be used to advance a very different conversation rather than used as a way of completely destabilizing the credibility of human experience. We're seeing a lot of that. What else might it be that might be more useful and helpful to us as a social community that are, through technology, actually being pulled apart? How might AI be used to counter the ways that a lot of technology is the thing that I'm most interested in? But you know, the AI cat is kind of out the bag, so to speak. And all of those people who are arguing about whether it should be, it is. And it's going to completely reshape in this moment forward. Like I see things online that people are responding to, which to my eye are obvious AI fabrications. But people are getting very engaged with them as if they're real, and they're clearly...
That's the problem, is what is reality.
And they're not. That is, it's really problematic. And a lot of that perpetuation of that kind of fabricated AI is being done by people that I would think would know better.
And that was the interesting problem with Photoshop, right? Because when did Photoshop become a problem? When National Geographic did a cover and all of a sudden they removed a back mountain, right? Yeah. That became the problem where it's like, well, photography's real, right? That became the conversation of like, no, photography is about this reality and representation. Photoshop already started that conversation to move to AI a long time ago. And I chose not to use Photoshop. I choose not to alter my images. You know, it's interesting, if I do a portrait sitting, often I do commissioned portraits, and somebody will say, hey, you'll take that off. And I'm like, no, actually I won't. I'm so sorry. You come to me and you get what you get. I'm so sorry. I'm not gonna like give you a facelift. It's just not what I do.
It's never the technology that's problematic. It's how that technology
it's how
is
it's used and abused.
The technology itself, AI is not a bad thing. You know, in a number of different fields outside of visual culture, it's proving to be extremely useful. In the medical profession, it's very useful. So AI is not the boogeyman. The boogeyman is how that technology can be used to the detriment of the larger, to the detriment of the cohesiveness of the larger social community, maybe we could say.
Do we have another question?
This is our last question.
Oh, okay.
We do have another question.
Oh, good. Check.
We do have another question. Hey, Kathy, welcome back.
Thank you.
Dawoud, welcome. I hope this doesn't sound like an overly simplistic question, but you alluded to that you're unique among photographers, that you've established iconic styles. And then you would switch between, landscape or a different way of studio versus street, does that sneak up on you? What is your experience, both of you please, of how that change starts to percolate and come through?
Okay, so the question is in relationship to all the different genres that we've explored within our kind of oeuvre of photography, how does that change the way that we think about, different movements that we make in the medium at different moments within our work? Did I do that okay? Okay.
Yeah, I don't necessarily, because I'm the maker of all of that, so I don't necessarily see it as being unconnected, one thing to the other. And it also springs from an intentionality of, not wanting to ask and answer the same questions repeatedly for decades. Because I think all of the work that I've made has been in response to asking a certain question, and then you answer it by making the work. You have another question. Well, how might I be able to continue to photograph African Americans in the urban environment, but in a way that's more participatory? It's a question. Well, you do that by getting a different camera, a camera that needs to be used more deliberately. Well, I've been in the street for a long time. What'll happen if I make photographs of people, but not on the street? Now we're in the studio. I mean, it's a progression of questions being asked, because the street portraits, I always, they're all completely staged by me and meant to look casual, but where the people in those photographs are, the environment is very important to the complete narrative and construction of the work. But of course, at some point begs the question of what would happen if you stay in this environment but take the subject out and just begin to look at place. So it's not as disconnected as it might appear. To me, the work is a series of ongoing questions that you ask, and in answering them, you figure out the ways and means, whether through the tool you're using or, the formal or conceptual ways of making the work. But to me, it's all related. And especially because I have those 6th grade portraits. I can trace it all the way back, really.
Yeah.
So, but it also comes from not wanting to repeat an answer. I answered that question.
Should I answer this really quickly, because I know you're cutting us off? Okay, I'll do a quick answer. So a lot of what Dawoud said is I start thinking about ideas in relationship to the questions that I'm personally trying to answer. And as I said before, that changes when your work changes and history changes. But I like to think of myself as, in some ways, I'm not a writer. Dawoud is a writer as well, but I am not a writer whatsoever. People have me write things, but don't read them. But
we're different in that way.
Yeah, but I think that I think of myself as a really long novelist. Like I think about the idea of what a writer is over years in relationship to how they develop their ideas and their craft, and that they follow one another in all of these different ways. But I think that my oh fuck moment, so to speak, sorry, is that going to get bleeped? Would have been the 1995 Whitney Biennial, where the work was first shown and Pervert was first shown. And I was like, oh, this is really, I know it's a big deal to be in the Whitney Biennial, but wow, this is now people have this idea of who I am. And they've made me into a singular identity. And I, by no far in this world, am a singular identity. I'm a much more complicated person than just the work that I was trying to grapple with. So immediately after that body of work came freeways. And everybody was like, freeways? What is she doing photographing freeways? Or when I first showed them, people were like, oh, those aren't Catherine Opie photographs. And so I also always have this moment out in the world where it's like people argue that with other people that, oh no, that's not a Catherine Opie. And I love that. I find that because you should have the fluidity within your own practice, within your ideas, for it to move through your life. Because if we're fortunate, we get to live long and think long, if we're fortunate. And so the work should be able to have that attitude and that place within ourselves as well. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
everyone. Thank you, Kathy. And thank you,
Thank you.
Dawoud.